Philip Cunliffe. Welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, John. Delighted to be here.
Well, delighted to have you in my ethereal realm here. I know we were saying before we pressed record, we've followed one another for some time on Twitter, and I've certainly enjoyed your work in the various places that you write, like Unheard and The Critic, and most recently your book about the national interest, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and I think very prescient, which I hope the viewers and listeners will recognize when they realize just how important the topic of the national interest is to politics in general, and how it's changed over time. But perhaps before we get there, and people aren't just taking my word on who it is you are and what it is you do, perhaps we can start with a brief introduction as to what you and your work's about, Philip, in the academic world, and why you chose to write a book on the national interest.
Sure, yeah. So I'm an associate professor in international relations at the Department of Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL, University College London. I've been there since 2022, and before that I was at the University of Kent, mainly based in Canterbury. It's got a couple of campuses. And throughout my academic career, my focus has mainly been on thinking about international relations theory, and on thinking in particular about conflict management and under changing conditions. So particularly with the decline of American power and leadership, how that shapes and changes the nature of conflict management, which is to say diplomacy, international intervention, mediation, and especially peacekeeping. So my PhD was on the changing dynamics of peacekeeping in global order. So, and that's taken me, I've covered a fair amount of terrain in that time, and that's taken me up to thinking about, in the aftermath of everything that's happened in the last couple of years, but especially since the election of Donald Trump and his second administration and his launch of these kind of multiple rounds of his trade war against the world, essentially, with new tariff barriers and trade disputes and so on, and all the ramifications of that in international order. This is all pushed to the forward. All of these developments and everything running up to them is pushed to the forward, thinking about the national interest, and it's brought it, kind of thrust it forward into my mind. I suppose, especially since the first Trump administration, and even more so Britain's vote to leave the European Union in 2016.
Well, perhaps before we get into definitions of the national interest and all the rest of it, so we can open the discussion up, picking up on some of the interesting points you made as to how you ended up thinking about this topic. So, as you say, with American power changing and its own priorities changing under Trump, which is effectively inverted, upended that rules-based international order, as people have talked about it for all those years since the 1930s and 1940s. Why is it that you thought, right, I'm going to get into the national interest question? Is it because ultimately Trump's actions and just the changing influence of America over the last couple of decades is now forcing countries to start thinking on their own 2 feet instead of relying upon a rules-based international order to get their cues from with regards to the actions that the states ought to take?
Yeah, so very much along the lines you indicated, that it's not just Trump. I mean, it's important stressing that. I mean, Trump himself is his populist campaigning in the United States against the globalist compact, accused American elites of having abandoned the national interest effectively in America in preference for global leadership and prioritizing the needs of others over the needs of American citizens. And that, that was consistent in his campaigning, in his administration, and also the basis on which, he won a second term. So all of that, though, is to say that reflects underlying changes in the distribution of power. So the populist insurrections that we see, of which Trump is the most prominent example, those are reverberations of deep tectonic shifts in international order, and most dramatically the industrialization of power and the industrialization of China and the shift in power towards East Asia. So Trump's policies are expressions of that, and they are forcing other countries to consider their role in international order in a way, like you say, that they didn't have to before. It could be taken for granted. And so part of the story of the last 50 years, like you say, people talk about the rules-based order, but I think that's a way of disguising more problematic developments that took place in that period. And what I describe in terms of the shift from the nation state to the member state over the course, roughly beginning over the middle of the last century. And that's to say, so a shift from a political organization or political apparatus, the state, that was organized and legitimated and authorized by the people that it claimed to represent, the nation, being slowly transformed into a member state, which is to say a state that was defined and authorized by the international networks into which it was embedded and integrated. So states became more defined by their horizontal relationships of international organization, transnational authority, international law, more than their relationship, a vertical relationship that used to exist with their own societies, their own people. And that's obviously, as one, as a listener or viewer might expect, that also came with an attenuation of the democracy within those nation states in the Western world, because the states disembedded themselves from their own society. Those links between their own society and the governing classes, governing elites, and various institutions of rule, those links became thinner, weaker, and in some cases snapped entirely. So we've inherited a situation where we have member states that are now being forced to confront a national interest in circumstances in which they fail to represent the nations that they supposedly stand for and are still legally accountable to, even if not politically responsible to. So we have this situation. So, we have Trump is certainly thrusting these questions upon all of the countries around the world. But thus far, we see very little evidence of these countries actually rising to the challenge. And I think Britain is a very important bellwether of this. It's precisely because Britain extracted itself from the European Union back in 2020. We have a precocious role in the breakdown of globalization and unipolarity. We had the honor, I think, in fact, of playing an important role in that process. And yet, in many ways, we're still a member state rather than a nation state. We still have a governing elite and political institutions that are more defined by their orientation outwards than their orientation towards the British people, the British nation.
Well, I suppose you can see evidence, whether it's in that now infamous Keir Starmer quote about feeling more at home in Davos than Westminster. I suppose you can see it in the attempt's the wrong word. In fact, the avoidance of utilizing the newfound or the rediscovered sovereignty that Brexit had delivered. And so we keep on going back to the EU to try to come up with new rules that we can comply with, so we can just have something handed to us and say, this is what you need to do. Would you agree that we are effectively currently governed by a political elite that is trying to avoid political decision making? Or would you say that's a cynical take?
No, not cynical at all. I think they entirely are. It's very, it's just obvious that having extracted themselves from the mesh in Brussels, that they find it tremendously difficult to establish a solid basis of rule, to coordinate policies, to come up with internally coherent platforms. And that's all because they don't have the linkages with their own population in a way that would effectively channel or concentrate popular will and allow it to be expressed through the institutions of government. And it's not only the fact the Labour Party is so weak as a political organisation. I mean, that's true of all of Britain's political parties. They're all, whether they're new or old, they're all weak and attenuated in different ways. The mass parties of yesteryear are long gone. But in addition to that, the member state, divests itself of power. It devolves power downwards to provincial assemblies. It outsources power to Brussels in the case of European member states, or to independent central banks in the case of the UK, as well as a host of kind of parastatal organizations. And so it also doesn't have the actual power to effect particular changes in order to meet popular demands and popular expectations. So we're also dealing with states that willingly restricted themselves by way of avoiding popular accountability. That is the member state, the state that's integrated into these rigid frameworks that encase them from the outside. So no, I think they're failing very much, like you say. We have a political elite that finds it is used to taking instructions and orders from the outside, is oriented outwardly, and so it's finding it tremendously difficult when they don't have those orders coming in, or they're mixed and confusing, as in the case when you have the leader of the so-called free world saying, you guys are on your own, or, we're going to cut deals in our own interest. It's not going to be on the basis of America kind of leading you and sorting out your problems for you, which has been the pattern for the last 30 to 40 years. So I just add one more thing, which is to say, it's not just the European Union.
No.
The embedded character of member statehood is also very evident in Britain in the form of Atlanticism, so a reflex cringe to Washington. And so the difficulty Britain's political elite face, having withdrawn from Brussels, is compounded by the fact that they really struggle to carve out a sense of political purpose that's separate from that of Washington. So the member state is not something which is only the European Union, but it's also the United Nations, it's also NATO, it's also simply the instinctive Atlanticism of our governing classes.
So let's think about the arc of how the national interest has changed over time or has been dissolved. So I suppose what you've hinted at there is that what we've, and I suppose is to paraphrase your book, in fact might almost be verbatim, is that a political transnationalism and a cosmopolitan ethic is effectively where we're at in our political circles here in the West, with the exception of the US, which has just branched out on a different path. And so, as you can imagine, if your view is transnational and you're about cosmopolitanism, you're probably not really thinking about the nation state, the national character, national interest per se, because you are likely to be, as you've pointed to, be outward focused rather than focusing on the inside. So maybe you could trot us through some of the key events and players over time, maybe even some spikes where the national interest has been something that has been understood and acted upon, but then how we got to this state of being ruled by a transnational cosmopolitan ethic.
Yeah, no, it's happily it's a great question. So in Britain, I suppose we're in the position in which one of the greatest or the most bold and dramatic statements of national interest was ever uttered by one of our politicians, in fact, which is Lord Palmerston in 1848. So the renowned British 19th century statesman, and he famously said in 1848, in the midst of all the tumult with the revolutions in Europe, and he was under pressure domestically about how far Britain should involve itself in all the turmoil in the European continent, and he said, we have no permanent allies, no permanent enemies, no permanent friends. Only our interests are eternal. And so this is often taken as the archetypal statement of national interest: complete discretion, complete flexibility, no external metric, no external standard, no external regulator or authority will limit or contain what is necessary to seize advantages and to pursue the path which is necessary for maintaining national independence. But you get from Viscount Palmerston saying that in the middle of the 19th century to 100 years later, when we have a situation in which, with the rise of the member state, the replacement of the nation state by the member state, you end up with a situation which is very much the reverse of that. You have states in the Western world, including Britain, that are defined by their by permanent special relationships, such as the relationship with Washington, by enduring alliance structures that last for decades and are not just pieces of paper. Organizations like the European Economic Community, the precursor to the European Union, or NATO, these are large bureaucratic organizations that are deeply intertwined with the functioning of domestic apparatuses, with government ministries. These aren't simply arrangements of mutual convenience. These are effectively outgrowths of domestic political structures, where it's almost difficult to see where one begins and the other ends. So the process by which that happens, in the book, I tell it in terms of the story of democratic enfranchisement. So the more democratic enfranchisement, the more popular will that you get concentrated in the nation state, the more difficult this is for political elites, and the more they seek to retreat from the pressure that can be put on them at the national level. And so it's precisely in the post-war period, in the 50s and 60s roughly, that you see the idea of the nation slowly eclipsed in political discourse, and it becomes replaced by the idea of the West, or the free world. So these become the concepts that are the highest ideals of political order rather than the nation. And so it's in this period that the national interest slowly begins to fade. And, it's a process. It's not an immediate thing, but it's slowly the idea of distinctive national interests, which are specific to different countries, and the expectation that Western countries will have different interests slowly begins to fade over this time. It becomes locked up in these permanent alliance structures, permanent friends, permanent enemies. And by the time you get to the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s and the era of globalization, the national interest has effectively faded from view. And at that point, the national interest simply becomes something which is the same as everybody else, right? Because of the era of globalization, the expectation is everybody's interests are the same: more trade, more open markets, more international integration, more privatization. And so there's no need to articulate a separate national interest, because everyone's, a rising tide lifts all boats. Everyone's effectively the same. So everyone's national interests are the same, and therefore any kind of political distinctiveness that might come in different countries is redundant or marginal, or so slender that it barely needs, thinking about, and it will be, kind of worn away in due course through the process of global integration in any case. So those would be, I think those would be three key staging posts in the history, would be the shift from the 19th century to the 20th century, the recoil from democratic enfranchisement and from popular accountability at the national level, the rise of globalization between the late 1980s and roughly the 2010s, and where we are now, where you have these member states that urgently need to carve out a new role for themselves in a world order that is no longer fitted to the role that they had been accustomed to playing.
Well, thinking about under what conditions a resurgence of thinking about the national interest might take root in, as you were talking there and about how the national interest became subverted, I suppose, with the global integrated market, which then led down to the breaking down of barriers. Obviously, there was lots of things to do with pluralism, free trade, egalitarianism, centralization, all the rest of it. A very Whiggish worldview that prevailed all those years ago, which George Owers wrote about in a great book called The Rage of Parties, showing how the Whig worldview won out and went to change the world. Is that liberal conception of the national interest, which I suppose there are people part of the kind of failing regime which you just described that are trying to hold on to liberal conceptions of it, and they're talking about national renewal and trying to use the national interest, but in the terms that we've just described. And it makes me wonder whether it's even possible to have anything pertaining to the national interest under those conditions, and whether actually the only way you could really have anything with the national interest would be if you recognize that nations are a deep-rooted thing, that people do make places, that culture is not an abstract thing, but it is the outgrowth of the practices of peoples over time, and that if you're going to treat anyone as commodities, whether it's the people already here, and you're going to effectively fill a country up with newcomers on an economic basis from all four corners of the world, and expect the national interest to somehow be delivered upon, if you even believe in it. I just wonder what you think might need to happen for politicians to start thinking about the national interest rather than um, always moving towards that Whiggish view of global open markets, and we can just continue taking on people and have people moving around, movement of labor all around the world, without expecting our politics to change over time, and thus
Hmm.
the national interest to change with it.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think there is any. There is, sometimes the national interest is mouthed, but it's not really. It's not deeply felt, and it's certainly not an embedded part of political life. And even in the cases of somebody like Trump, it's a very poor parody, I would say, almost of the national interest. I mean, America, obviously, because it's overwhelmingly the most powerful state in its hemisphere. It's insulated on both sides by oceanic defenses, as well as still being the world's richest and most powerful state, despite its relative decline. So, it has this space and insulation with which it can experiment with kind of populist foreign policy of the style of Trump. So most recently, kind of in the news, it was indicated, the Canadians ran this advert where they were showing old reels of Ronald Reagan, the Republican president, criticizing tariffs by way of indicating that the Trump administration has, drifted from its Republican roots, and that the Canadians were better exponents of real American ideals than the Trump administration. And apparently Trump was so outraged by this that he slapped more tariffs on Canada, and now, relations with Canada are now bitter again after having seemed to have improved. That's not, that's not a impressive kind of practice of the national interest. That indicates somebody that if the national interest is something that's bound up with the personality of a single charismatic leader, and it simply rests on his whims, that is not, a meaningful national interest. So even what I'm saying, I suppose, is that even in the case of a country like America, where you seem to be having a return to something of an, kind of a reassertion of national interest, it's still limited and hemmed in important ways because it's so bound up with populist politics. So if we're going to have something more meaningful than just that, because I think every country would like to avoid that kind of Trumpy vision of national interest politics, effectively personalist politics, then we need political structures. We need new political institutions. You need new forms of political representation, new forms of political accountability, and ultimately new nations. I think this is really, the story of the last 30 years is that process of effectively diluting nation states, of integrating into global institutions, was a way of weakening political accountability, weakening political identity in order to weaken political accountability, in order to dilute the power of majoritarian democracy, and in order to reduce people's expectations of what was legitimate to claim from their political leaders. So we need to recreate that. And my hope is that we can do that with the national interest in making it a part of public life. So something which isn't seen to be the property either of foreign ministries or bureaucrats or even charismatic leaders such as Trump, but something which everyone is entitled to discuss and talk about. Something which people should feel like, if they're thinking about what they want, it's my hope is, as the result of the book and propagating this argument more widely, is that people frame their hopes and aspirations in terms of the national interest. And through that process, we can begin putting more pressure on national leaders to be accountable to their nations, to their peoples, and hopefully also help create a process by which we begin to crystallize a new national identity. If we think about all the things that anyone might want, whether as an individual or as a group or a community or, a member of a professional association, if we begin thinking about those things in terms of the national interest, it forces us to relate to other people's needs and interests within the state, within the nation, and helps us, in principle, to start the process of knitting together a new national interest, which is based on incorporating other people's views, based on accommodating other people's views, but also putting forward our own interests and making other people adjust to our demands and interests. A new popular politics built around the nation state. But they'll have to be as a result of the fact that we've lost the old nation states and we have the political structures of member states. We will need new nations and new political structures to come with them.
Have you seen any examples starting to develop for these the framework for these new national structures as we watch the member state world, I suppose, start to crumble?
Yeah, sadly, very little. There's some performative, so as I gave, there's one kind of striking populist example of it in the States, but that's the national interest as personal whim of Donald Trump. So that seems to be an insufficient model, an insufficient solution.
And
We
sorry
see
to
some.
jump in there
Yeah.
just for a moment, Philip, on the Trump point. It is a very interesting point you make about that. Ultimately, it sometimes seems like the last person he spoke to has changed his mind for good or ill. It does seem as though there are quite large parts of his administration who, like Vance, like people that have been brought on, he was a Substacker, but has become, I think, quite a key part of their policy. But NS Lyons, who's done a very good job of charting how a lot of the things we talked about came into being, but how ultimately we're seeing a return of the strong gods and people want the national interest to be thought about. So it does feel like there's a disconnect between Trump personal whims, and actually there seems to be quite a few people within his administration that want to actually deliver on that, but actually they have to just play the lip service in some way. So it'll be quite interesting to see how that develops should any of his administration remain behind in future terms. But anyway, yes, I agree. I think having a national interest tied up in one person is unstable.
No, so, I mean, what I would say is this about Trump with I don't, so, I know there's this line that he kind of follows the last person he talked to. I never really bought that, because if you look back from the 1980s, he's always been a tariff man. And a lot of his political views seem to have remained more or less the same since the late 1980s in terms of rapprochement with Russia, trying to end the threat of nuclear war. The only real difference is that he was most concerned with the rise of Japan in the late 1980s, and now it's China rather than Japan. But it's still the question of protecting American industry and protecting American markets from foreign competitors. So it's more that that he cultivates a political leadership which is based around his personal discretion. Like as the example of his punishing Canada off the back of a stupid advert. It seems to me like a real national interest and a real, kind of a really responsible leader would have risen above something like that, because obviously it's in America's national interest to keep the Canadians on board, and he would have drawn a line under it because it's something that wouldn't affect America's national interest, but it does affect his ego. Now, the larger question as to whether or not there are deeper elements within the MAGA coalition that might be the anchors for a deeper transformation and a new national interest, like you say, we'll have to wait and see. I think the problem for them is that so much of that coalition is held together by Trump's personality alone, by his individual leadership, and that so much of the authority of the MAGA movement is vested in Trump himself as a leader. So what happens after that, whether or not he's able to pass the torch on to an anointed successor, and also how far that feeds into American politics. The other element of that, though, also is if the national interest is seen to be something which is the property of the right, then we are no further ahead, really.
Mm,
Because my hope is what we really need is that both left, right, and liberal center, the old political categories, that they see whatever they want, they see it in terms of something that is internal to the nation, and that the primary constituency and the primary vehicle for whatever changes they might want to see should be the nation,
mm,
the people within their states, rather than electoral constituencies or the global conservative movement or the global left. Or I think that is part of the problem that we've inherited from the era of globalization.
mm. Yes, I would certainly agree. There's no need for it to drop onto, although it has, the rails of the culture war, which uh, I think that's going to be the problem, right? Is that the political right is likely always going to be the one picking up the can on this because it thinks in terms of the nation, whereas for as long as the left and increasingly the centre um, wants to be focused on transnationalism
Yeah.
in whichever form they want, is they're never going to move towards a national interest because what they've done is they've said it's a boogeyman that leads to bad things.
Yes.
It leads to fascism, and I'm
Yes.
probably making a bit of a leap here, but Rory Stewart very recently was
Yes.
on a TV show where he said, people are looking around at all of these problems, and there are so many problems besetting the company, and unfortunately, the solution they come up with looks a lot like fascism. But in
Yeah.
reality, let's think about what he's referring to there, right? You've got people who are saying, "Look, we've had more immigration every year since the Anglo-Saxon period. We've got at least 200,000 migrants, legal migrants that have arrived on boats over, I don't know, say 5 years or something, that are now spread across the country, and we see bad news stories every single day. We have many of our cities are now minority majority, so we have white British in the minority. Again, it's not a race point, but it's a people are culture, and we do see political sectarianism arising out of diasporas that are recently arrived in the last 50, 60 years. I don't think there is anything pertaining to fascism for a bunch of people in the country to go, hang on, is any of this in our national interest? Should we start thinking about how to dissolve those problems? So, how is it that we either lead to integration, or in the event that can't happen, how do we get rid of that problem because the national interest is not being served? But if you have people in the center saying anyone who raises an issue with the problems of a highly financialized state that has outsourced all of its industry and that is importing lots of people that are either competing with other welfare dependents or for handouts from the welfare state and the lower ends of the labour market, if you just say fascism, that means that everyone on the left and centre just thinks any discussion of the national interest is bad. And so how do we get them back in the fold so they can do what you're talking about, Philip, which is, come on, let's just have a sensible discussion about whether all those things mentioned by people who, by the way, probably were Labour voters at one point,
Yeah.
can actually be seen as legitimate topics for the national interest and not behind some cordon sanitaire.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think so. I think this will be forced upon everyone to a greater or lesser degree, in as much as the transformation of global order means that people will have to look to domestic sources of legitimacy and authority to enact what they want.
Mm,
So I think this is the. So I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said, but in terms of your challenge of how do you, how can you expect the left and the liberals to be included within a new political nation, and to accept the fact that that their political aspirations need to be rooted through the nation rather than through transnational hopes and transnational and globalist institutions. I think that that is forced upon us, all of us, including the left and the liberals, by the fact the
mm,
Americans are basically rolling up the empire, or at
mm,
least withdrawing the American empire to their own hemisphere. So, and as much as Donald Trump has said that it's America first, and we're not, Dad isn't going to come to your room and tell you to tidy up, or you're not going to get any pocket money, that is over. that kind of in which we expect political order and political authority to be provided from the outside, that is over. And so the sooner that we all accept that, and especially the left and especially liberals, then we can start thinking about what kind of
Mm,
nation we want, and that we have to accept then certain kinds of compromises, certain kinds of hard political realities for all Western states, all of which, with the exception of the US, are middle powers, effectively, in terms of, their economic weight and political weight in the global order. And they have the potential to be prosperous once again. They have the potential to be technologically dynamic, wealthy, and also bastions of liberty and democracy. But that is contingent on them accepting a new role in the world and being willing to defend their interests rather than outsourcing it to America. So,
mm,
I suppose if that hostility towards Trump can be turned to their kind of, because at the moment, I think a lot of people on the left, they hate Trump as if they lived in America.
mm,
British leftists hate Trump as if not my president is almost their slogan. Well, it's true. He's not your president, because he isn't the British prime minister.
mm,
So this attitude of still thinking that we live in the free world and he's the leader of the free world, right? That has to end.
mm,
And then instead of thinking in terms of living in the free world where dad tells you what to do, and you can be an angry teenager or a obedient teenager, that is over. And you might have the hope of living in a free nation,
mm,
right? But it's something you have to build for yourself because nobody is going to do it for you.
mm,
So I suppose, I mean, this is, you've put a significant challenge to me, and I'm stretching here, but I hope at least, that perhaps there is some hope in that anti-Trump hostility, that it can be bent towards national purposes if
mm,
people accept that there's nobody going to come in to sort their problems out for them. Neither
mm,
Brussels nor Washington. Things have to be done domestically. But and I would just to add, I mean, I think that's also a serious problem for the right. The instinct
mm.
of Atlanticism. If you look at, say,
Agreed.
the politics of reform, the foreign policies of reform, it seems to be, very kind of deferential and viscerally kind of connected to NATO. And so that Atlanticism, and with it the cringe towards external political authority, I think might be buried there. But also, it requires more than just restoration. So I don't have any pat answers about culture, but I
Mm,
do think that I think culture will follow politics. So if we restore national political systems, national political institutions, I think culture will organize itself and flow in those channels and organize itself around these new institutions, and hopefully that's a more organic way for that development to take place without requiring kind of heavy-handed state involvement in culture in order to try and engineer kind of particular outcomes.
mm. Well, I think you're right. I think we can do lots of theorizing about potential scenarios in the future, but actually, there are flashpoints which are typically set in train by those who actually have power and influence. And in this respect, America effectively being the global hegemon up until, well, and still is to a certain degree, uh, and certainly had its own sphere of influence, has, as you say, decided this isn't the game we're playing anymore. We're off to go and play our own game over here, sort yourselves out. Is we can pretend that game's still being played for some time, but in the end, when you realize that either drawbridges are being pulled up or there is your balance of payments are going up,
Yeah.
and you realize, oh, hang on a second, I know we're 70 years into a project which is seen as deindustrialize or change the population rapidly and all the rest of it, but there are certain things we're going to have to start undoing here if we're going to remain coherent or become coherent once more and have some sense of actually caring about the flourishing of our own people rather than abstract ideals of international cooperation, which the opportunities to be able to engage in are being wrapped up uh, as we speak. And I think what's interesting are there are definitely some people within the left and the centre and the right that have already started to spot that this game is up. And I think um, one of them, and he's, I think, probably always ends up becoming people's favourite politician when they learn of him, William Clouston of the SDP. You know, he's a man who describes himself as a left conservative and very much considers um, uh, party policy with regards to national interest. I suppose you've got people working for the likes of Robert Jenrick, like Sam Bidwell, who on policy on various things is thinking about what the national interest is. And whilst you've mentioned Reform, who I know one of the big criticisms of Farage is ultimately he's like the final throw of whatever the previous system was in its early stages. He's actually more of an establishment figure than you think he is. He's trying to get away from recent insanities. But he's still very much that kind of boomer liberal. Is you have people like Danny Kruger, who definitely is thinking about policy in the national interest. So, and one more point, I suppose, within Labour, even though it has been absolutely crowded out for, well, since the rise of Blair, really, you've got the Blue Labour movement, Maurice Glassman, Paul Embury. These are all national interest guys. They come across the whole spectrum, but all of these people have to one degree or another been diminished or at least kept to one side. But I think what we're seeing is the influence of these ideas growing and growing because the reality is starting to dawn on everyone that you can't actually avoid this for much longer.
Yeah, I certainly hope you're right, and I do take some heart from some of the some of the individuals and phenomena that you've pointed to. So that is, some of that is heartening. I have my reservations about all of them, to one degree or another, either in respect of specific political points of disagreement, or my lack of belief, or my disbelief that they have the capacity to enact what they say. So, I guess we'll wait and see. But the main thing I would add to it is that it's really vital, I think, that it's not something which is restricted to certain political elites or tendencies. So it's really important, I think, that ordinary people begin to put their political hopes in terms of the national interest, or whatever political aspirations they have in terms of the national interest. And that would be my plea, I suppose, to anyone listening, or any viewers, would be whatever they would like to see, whatever they hope for, that if they framed it in terms of the national interest, that it would be a boost to their claims, but also a boost to all of us, because we would all have a more productive political debate if we refracted our aspirations folded it through the idea or the prism of the national interest, because the nation is the jurisdiction within which we have the most scope for exercising political agency. So this is kind of a challenge, because I'm, as we said at the beginning, I'm a university lecturer. So the big debate on campus is obviously Gaza, Israel. And what I notice in those debates among students and academics is the national interest is never raised. So the people who are pro-Palestine, they never make the case in terms of the national interest for why we should support Palestine or Gaza. It's always made in terms of our obligations under humanitarian law to prevent a moral atrocity of genocide, that we're, or indeed even in terms of sectarian terms of Islamic solidarity. On the other side, the people who are pro-Israel, they make often their claims in cultural terms, kind of defending an outpost of Western civilization, striking back against fanatical terrorism, or defending liberal democracy, and that we're allied with the Israelis and therefore we should carry on supporting them. And again, those are kind of autopilot style arguments. They're not arguments that are expressly framed in terms of national interest. So I hope the national interest is not just something which is which we see something which is just for people, like William Clouston or Robert Jendrick or Danny Kruger, however supportive or admiring we might be of their individual ideas. It's got to be something, if it's going to win, and if we're going to collectively improve our stance as a nation, it's got to be something which ordinary people run with.
Well, I don't think we can ever avoid getting into the talk of immigration, so I apologise in advance. And I know that there are some commentators. I heard Lionel Shriver say recently she went to meet Peter Boghossian, and they said, "Look, let's have a conversation, but I don't want to talk about immigration." And then they couldn't help it. And I think the reality is there's just so much of it. As in, there is a lot of immigration and has been for a long time, and it is changing the country. And so the reason why I bring it up is when we're talking about the national interest, clearly nations are rooted in people, in ideas, in cultural and political norms. I think what we can see, for example, if we look in what's happened in the last couple of weeks here in the United Kingdom, so in London recently, there was a planned march by UKIP, the kind of rump of what remains of UKIP under a new leader, Nick Tenkoni, that was going to go through Tower Hamlets, which is a very heavily Bengali Muslim area. And effectively, they were banned from doing it. And what you saw on the streets instead was you had anti-fascist protesters, so lots of people who would be aligned with the political left, I would say broadly white and middle class. And on the other side, you had lots of masked up, black hoodie wearing Bengali Muslims waving Bangladeshi flags and talking about this being our area. Now, the reason why I bring this up is if you look at demographic projections for the country, I think it has recently been said that by 2050, the English will be a minority in England. So there'll be fewer than 50% English people, which is down from, say, 97% in 1960 or something. So a huge change. And if a nation is and its future is going to be defined by its people, the whole thing, demographics are destiny, and you know that those Bengali Muslims at Tower Hamlets are going to have different political views, different cultural norms, all the rest of it. And you could apply that to any of the big diaspora areas. If we're moving towards a minority majority future, could we argue that the national interest on that timeline is going to change depending on who's coming to power? Because if we have 5 pro-Gaza independents in the parliament and they are talking about airports in Mirpur, or they're talking about cousin marriage, or they're talking about banning Israeli fans from Aston Villa games, we can see that that is distinctly different from whatever conception of the national interest we've had for Britain in the past. So I suppose, where do you see it going? We've mentioned a whole bunch of people from probably the kind of typical places you'd expect in British politics, but actually none of them from the future demographics of the country. So what does the national interest look like under that scenario? And could you make the argument that going in that direction is very much against the national interest?
I would say that certainly the the social and demographic makeup of the country is changing, but that seems to me to be. But though irrespective of where migration was, Britain would be and look a very different place in 2050, regardless. So I suppose what I see as the challenge is what we need to do is to build a new nation, and that requires political integration. So nations are also they're artifacts of political structures and political institutions. And the closest really that Britain has had to a nation state, and here I'm following the historian David Edgerton, that's the era really between the interwar period, the 1920s, up until the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s. And there you have the most compact era of Britain as a nation. And before that, really, the idea of Britain is much more of a kind of a globalist imperial idea associated with free trade, associated with global Anglicanism and various Protestant denominations, associated with the empire. And so it's this much more kind of diffuse identity. So I think identities have changed over time, but the idea of a nation and the idea of having a nation state, that is something which appears and disappears at different points in Britain's history. And we have an opportunity, I think, to recreate it now, but it requires it requires a willingness to build a new nation, which is to say, to incorporate, to cut away these diasporic and transnational identifications,
Mm.
which are not specific just to Britain's ethnic minorities or Bengali Muslims. I mean, I think the greatest proponents, in fact, of this kind of transnational identification is the white middle class left
Hmm.
with Palestine or
Yeah.
or their support for the European Union. So all of that has to be broken. All of that kind of transnational identification and diasporic politics,
Mm.
including diasporic political loyalties of various kind of migrant populations. I think all of that it's legitimate to expect that within a functioning democracy that people's primary political identification and loyalty is with the nation where they reside. So it's a process of political integration.
Mm.
And notwithstanding the cultural changes and demographic changes, and also, like you, I was very disturbed to see the confidence with which you had these sinister-looking marchers marching through the East End, denouncing Zionists in terms that would have made Oswald Mosley happy from the 1930s, the same place where he was chased out of back in the 1930s. We have, I think, three advantages which are political and
Mm.
which we need to make use of. And those are, we have, and still just about have them in Britain. We have the old constitution, which is to say the common law as a system of legislation. We have parliamentary sovereignty and supremacy, the concentration of political power in this omnicompetent legislature. And we also have a multinational union, the nation at least of a very successful and enduring national union, at least on this island, between the Welsh, the Scottish and the English.
Mm.
And those are three political advantages that so far have served us well. Now, it's not just, they're hemmed in various ways by our continuing membership of the ECHR, by the Human Rights Act, by the Supreme Court, the efforts to Americanize our national system. But notwithstanding that, we still have those three powerful engines of political integration and potentially political power, and we should use them in order to build a new kind of nation, a nation that will certainly look different and have people from different parts of the world, but that will create something new, a new people and a new nation. So that seems to me to be that we have advantages that our peers in Europe do not,
Mm.
by virtue of the fact of being outside of the European Union and those political institutions that I mentioned. So I think I would say, and this in fact goes back to our earlier debate about liberalism,
Mm.
that nations they're primarily political. I think, I leave it to others to talk about national culture. I mean, I'm a political scientist, so perhaps by virtue of my profession, I'm most interested in those questions. But it seems to me that if we think of the nation in political terms, then we have certain advantages and certain ways by which we can meet the challenges that you've outlined.
Mm. Well, I hope so. I would say I'd probably temper that with political integration. All of what you've described there sounds like it would be obviously a good thing. But I think there would have to be some serious power behind it, because I suppose what you're talking about is, whilst it might be easier for us to get our heads around, because being from a 400-500 year liberal project where things are certainly a bit more malleable, is we are talking about diasporic cultures who are from a very different background, who have their own folk cultures, their own religious cultures. Culture comes downstream from religion, their own legal practices. We also have the technological kind of advancements which have led to anyone being able to be connected to anyone anywhere on the planet, and to sit and watch things all in their own language, all the rest of it, and to care about politics back home. And so if we're talking about the forging of a new nation, and we're talking about people having to give up something, well, I think the challenge you'll get from the political right is, well, is this not just more of hard multiculturalism where so much has had to be given up by the host population up until now? But then the other challenge you'll get is, but some people are so rooted in their identity that effectively what we're calling upon here is, and this is me coming up with an analogy that might not be great, but if we think about Alfred the Great and the defeat of the Danes, and then the forging of, or what went on to become England, which was, okay, right, Saxon or Dane, forget about it. We're all English, all under the same flag. And actually what happened were the Danes depaganized, became Christian, and then stopped with getting all their pals over to loot and pillage and all the rest of it. So what chances do we think there are of the diaspora throughout the country actually going, do you know what? I'm not going to live in South Hall and see it as a Hindu Indian area, or I'm totally comfortable being here in Tower Hamlets and just giving up all of those particular um, um, points, because I guess the 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 advantage you say we have of being in a very on an island in which we've had the Scots, the Welsh, and the English learn to live together, that did come with a lot of bloodshed over the years, a lot of political maneuvering, and we're talking about 1,500 years of learning to live together. And this is all, throw everyone into a pot and see how it goes. So um, I'm with you, Philip. I want those things to happen. I would like some kind of peace, and I'd like us to learn to live in peace and prosperity like the British peoples did. But I'm just wondering how possible or how likely that's going to be that people are going to willingly slough off some of these things and forget about those other elements. Because what are we going to ask people to give up? Is the question, I suppose.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. I suppose the example of Alfred the Great is germane in as much as despite I think some common misconceptions about English political history, one of the strengths of English political history, and it's a vitality that's still felt in, like I said, the common law and the supremacy of Parliament, is just how deeply rooted a central state is in English history, and that stems right from that period of the formation of an early English state under Alfred the Great. So that capacity to use centralized political authority as a way of integration, that seems to me to be deeply rooted, and that gives me, some kind of measure of hope. I'm not, and I take your points about the challenges that would be put to me to the case I've put forward. I'm not advocating a hard multiculturalism. So if we understand multiculturalism politically, it's a very conscious rather than culturally. I don't mean multiculturalism in terms of having a menu of different styles of cuisine, for your delivery order. I mean, everybody likes that, and that's not. I'm not talking about kind of social multiculturalism, but multiculturalism in political terms was very specifically an effort to dilute the power of electoral majoritarianism. And to that extent, it wasn't the majority population in Britain was white British, and therefore that required kind of cultural delegitimization. But it's not specifically any more. That was its intent. Its intent was anti-democratic. So, and politically, that's what multiculturalism is about. It's about saying that electoral democracy, mass democracy, is dangerous because it threatens minorities, and it's a way of holding the majority in check. You need to restrain yourselves. You don't matter so much. You need to think of other people's needs, the human rights of distant strangers in foreign places, but also the vulnerable here. So it's a way for political elites to strengthen themselves and for bureaucratic elites to play divide and rule, more easily. And it's also worth, pointing out that that's also something which is unfortunately, deeply embedded in British political history, and that's a legacy of the empire. And that's the way, there's Churchill's famous line, hug the Muslim to harm the Hindu, the rule for how they ruled India. So that kind of sectarian politics of divide and rule comes very easily to a globalist oriented political elite. And this is now the policies that they effectively use to rule the metropole. They're treating the old metropole of the empire as if it was a province. So that's the kind of the last sorry act of the British Empire in a way. So that's what we have to try and overcome. And so what I'm advocating is political monoculturalism. It's not any variety of multiculturalism, and that requires hard political integration. Now, I think, those diasporic identifications can be broken up, partly because a lot of them thrive in the shade of the middle class transnationalism, the liberal transnationalism that we already talked about. So the affinity of white liberals for Palestine, for climate change, for Afghanistan, for Iraq, whatever the cause du jour is, and that, I think, if that is rolled in, it'll be much harder for other groups to claim diasporic identification. But also, I think, it can be just have if we're willing to have these kinds of open discussions and conversations, then all of Britain's peoples, including those who have diasporic connections and family connections around the world, and many people do, including myself. Like if you look around the world, then you can say, well, where am I going to put my hopes? Because the thing that we talked about before about the Americans backing off, that applies everywhere. They're not going to come to the rescue of the Kurds. They're not going to come to the rescue of even the Israelis. Trump is kind of distancing himself from Israel in a way that is remarkable and striking. They're not going to come to the rescue of your kind of vulnerable, your particular identitarian cause bound up with ethnic conflicts in a remote part of the world. And so when you've got Trump and China and Vladimir Putin, where are you going to vest it in some kind of United Nations agency campaign? Are you going to vest your hopes in the US Agency for International Development that was rolled up? Are you going to prioritize issues abroad, or can you be persuaded to pitch in to the place where you live and the jurisdiction that you share under a common authority with other people? And that seems to me to be the offer, and that does mean losing things, right? And that has to be accepted, the kind of the connections abroad. And, if you want to carry on watching, kind of news channels from back home in your own language and, whatever, that's part of global communications. That's something to be embraced and not to be afraid of, I think. But political loyalties to be rooted through the state of which you're a citizen, if you are a citizen indeed, and political loyalties to be focused in that area and to focus to identify as a national of this particular state, that needs to be created. And that seems to me, like I say, given that the same processes affecting everyone's judgment will also impact on these diasporic identities. And you got to decide, are you going to stay with some kind of ancient ethnic cause that's kind of stretched out across many different countries now and held together by WhatsApp messages and Telegram or whatever? Or are you going to pitch in with the possibility of a free, prosperous country, in the case of Britain, that has nuclear weapons? That's got to be the option that's put before people, and I think that will help to focus people's minds.
Well, Philip, I really appreciate you taking the time to get into those ideas of what a new nation would look like and how people might become a part of it, because I think not many people try to articulate that, as far as I can tell. So that's definitely credits to you. I appreciate I've taken a whole bunch of your time already, but what I would like to ask you is the question I ask all of my guests who come on the show, which is, what have you changed your mind on during the course of your life? It might have been something big, it might have been something more day to day. And what was it that made you think differently? Why was it significant?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've tried to think about it and to come up with an answer. And it's not easy, because obviously it's very easy to delude yourself into thinking that you've always, you've never changed your mind. And, it's hard for people to admit that they've made mistakes or that they've changed their mind. I would say, so I think my concern with maximizing the possibility for self-rule, maximizing freedom and self-government. Those have long, that's long been my primary concern or my primary political kind of hope.
Mm.
The ways in which you get to that, I've changed my mind about, but the underlying idea has stayed the same. The big personal Rubicon for me, so in answer to your question, a big personal Rubicon for me was my belief that the academy, the professoriate, and the university sector would be able to course correct without external intervention. So I clung to this libertarian view for a long time, this hope, desperate hope, increasingly desperate hope, that academic freedom was something that academics would come round to seeing to be in their professional interest, in preserving their institutional autonomy, their ability to cultivate intellectual diversity and differences of views, and that it would be possible to impose this upon them because it was within their interest to do so. And so, but, after years of attending kind of very thinly attended academic freedom panels, signing lots of crappy petitions with, maybe 100 or so signatories defending this or that cause of academic freedom and free speech on campus, and then especially through lockdown and seeing how many academics supported online teaching in place of teaching in the classroom, it brought me to the sad conclusion that there was no possibility of the academy correcting itself from the inside through an organic transformation, and that it would require external intervention from the state. So that was a very important change in my view, was the acceptance of the need for state involvement in institutions that historically have been very jealously protective of their independence, and whose freedom was an important component of civil society and its separateness from the state. But with the most recent, from the last Tory government, the PIFOSA legislation, the higher protection of academic freedom and higher education, which fortunately this Labour government has just about kept going, that I've been... that's something which I came to initially regretfully kind of accept with heavy heart, but slowly see that because it was a necessity, it had to be embraced and taken further. I see there. So that was a big personal change in my thinking, the acceptance of state involvement in the academy in order to bring about necessary changes to safeguard academic freedom, because the sector was incapable of sustaining it itself.
Interesting. Would you describe your political views as being broadly aligned to something approximating libertarianism, and then a kind of begrudging acceptance of state intervention where required, or am I off the mark there?
No, I mean, I was in my youthful kind of days as a university student. Certainly, I skewed libertarian in many of my instinctual responses. It was never particularly consistent or dogmatic, and my instincts are certainly, I would say, pro-liberty in anything meaningful that I could think of in terms of civil liberty, political restrictions on speech, political speech, whatever it might be. Generally my instincts skew in that direction. What I appreciated more recently, I suppose, is and it shouldn't come as such as a surprise, but I suppose it did, given the fact that we're in England, was the fact that liberty has emerged through accepting the necessity for centralized authority and political representation. And that's the lesson of classical the liberal social contract, the ideas of Hobbes and Locke and their subsequent followers, was this idea that liberty is meaningful in a condition of civil society in which there is security provided by a central authority. And I think my libertarianism, such as it was partly also a result of missing that dimension of it, because I lived in the American, in a province of the American Empire. So I missed the idea of liberty as something libertarian, which is just so, kind of do whatever you want as long as you don't harm anyone. That's all you need to think about, really. That was, I think, also kind of a luxury belief that was a product of growing up living through the heyday of the American Empire. And now that we're past that peak, it's pressed upon me the idea that I need to remember that liberty is something that is bound up with sovereignty. And in this case, the sovereignty of the national state of which I'm a citizen.
Hmm.
So that has helped to focus my mind in terms of thinking more discriminatingly and more thinking harder, I suppose, about how that needs to be won and defended rather than just imagining that it's something cultural or something which is about striking a pose or, like that.
Hmm. Fascinating. Well, I think Socrates said something like life's mission is to know thyself. Well, you seem to be passing the test, Philip. Um, Philip, before I let you go, you've written a book, The National Interest. Perhaps you can tell everyone where they can find that, and also where they can find you in the dark corners of the internet, and whether we can expect anything else coming out from you in the near to mid future.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, John. So, as you mentioned, the book was released in July here in the UK. It's just been released this month, October, in the US. The National Interest Politics After Globalisation. It's published with Polity Press, available from the Polity website, but also Amazon and all the major bookshops as usual. You can easily find it online. I can be found on X at the Philippics. And the same handle on other social media platforms. What I'm working on at the moment is thinking about as I mentioned, how managing conflict works out in the aftermath of American unipolarity, but also trying to think through what political freedom looks like under multipolarity. That's my next big project. So those are
Mm.
some of the strands growing out of this most recent project, National Interest.
Well, I look forward to seeing the fruits of those labours, and I hope that I can invite you back on the show to talk about them when they come to fruition. If I'm going to carry that metaphor on to the very end.
I would love to. It's been great to know. I genuinely appreciate you posing me hard questions and challenges about these questions of nation building and political integration.
Well, thank you, Philip. I appreciate you engaging with it, and also from putting things in front of me that I hadn't thought of before. So let's keep that good spirited debate going in future, and keep fighting the good fight.